All right, the Supreme Court, as you heard, is not going to be rushing this push on the part of Special Counsel Jack Smith to hear this case, whether the former president can go ahead and claim immunity, some of the decisions that were made while he was president, thereby nullifying all of the charges against him. That's not going to happen. An appeals court takes it up. It's going to delay all of this. We've got with us now the former Attorney General of the United States, Bill Barr. Attorney General, very good to have you.
Good to see you, Neil. Merry Christmas.
To you as well, my friend. First off, your thoughts on what the Supreme Court did.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's that big a deal. Sometimes litigants try to leapfrog over the intermediate court and get right to the Supreme Court if the argument is that time is of the essence. We did that in the Trump administration in some cases, and apparently it was done here by the special counsel because he obviously wants the trial to go ahead on schedule. So he tried this, and it failed. The court wants to go in regular order. I believe the circuit court, the intermediate court, will reach a ruling promptly, and I'm not sure the Supreme Court will take it after that. But in any event, I still think the trial may go forward during the spring, but it may not go forward as originally scheduled at the beginning of March.
What if this court, the appeals court, rules that the former president does have immunity from all of this? He was president at the time. This came within the context of his being president at the time. And the Supreme Court not only wouldn't take it up, I would imagine that could be potentially case closed. But what do you think?
Right. I mean, I think if the intermediate court says he has immunity, then as a practical matter, whether or not the Supreme Court takes it up, I think the case isn't going to maybe over completely, but certainly it wouldn't be tried before the election. I don't think it's, my view is that they're probably going to rule that this is one of those cases where there have to be a lot more facts developed to determine how immunity applies.
The core of the former president's argument and legal team's argument is to challenge a lot of this and push it back. And some have argued that he's running out the clock, but that it's working for him. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, his strategy is to run out the clock, and he has a lot of tools to do that, and he may be successful. The issue here, I think everyone agrees that there's something called absolute immunity for your official functions. If you're performing an official function, the president has absolute immunity, and I think that has to be protected. I support that. The real question here is what was the function he was performing when he was doing these things after the election? And the government's position is going to be that he was a candidate. He was acting as a candidate, not really as president. And the president's argument is going to be, and I think, that whenever he uses an official function, if he directs the department to do something, even if the purpose is as a candidate, but if he uses that tool, then he's immune, and that's where the case is going to hinge.
There are a lot of people who've looked back and forth at the election, whether it was rigged or stolen, whatever. There are a lot of people who dispute that. They say there have been a lot of investigations and lawsuits and recalls, even recalls of recalls, that have concluded that Donald Trump did in fact lose the last presidential election. But it comes down as well, I guess, in legal matters, Attorney General, whether he truly believes that and believed it then, believes it now, and does that make a difference in how he challenges all of these allegations, even now and going forward?
Well, I'm not going to talk right now about what I think his state of mind was. I mean, that's going to be a matter that, if the case goes forward, is going to be litigated there. Actually, I think technically, I'm not sure it really matters what he believed. The example I use is that you may believe a bank is unfairly or illegally holding your money, that they legally should give it to you. But there are a lot of steps you can take to get it back, but you can't go and rob the bank. So the real question to me is whether the acts he took were illegal acts, not whether he thought he was taking them in a good cause.
You had argued separately, Attorney General, this Colorado move to remove Donald Trump's name from the ballot next year, the presidential ballot, that was a step too far. I think you called it legally wrong. At least a dozen, I think up to 16 states now are looking at doing the exact same thing. So hence the rush for the High Court, maybe the Supreme Court itself, to take this up and fast. Do you agree with that?
Oh, yes. I hope the court has to smack this down very quickly. I think the legal argument here for it is ridiculous, and I think even more importantly, it is highly destructive, and it's exactly the kind of tactics by the left that created Donald Trump in the first place. They're sort of anything goes tactics that created Trump in the first place, and that continue to breathe life into him. So Russiagate and the bogus cases in New York and the cases in Atlanta and so forth strengthen him. And this is an example. This has helped Trump, and I think legally it's ridiculous. There's no question that the 14th Amendment says that if you took an oath to support the Constitution and then engage in an insurrection, that you can't hold office again. The question is who decides and how is that decided? And everyone, I think what's clear here is even if you think the states can decide it one by one through ad hoc processes, and I don't believe that, and I think that's wrong, but even if you believe that, there clearly has to be due process, and there was clearly no due process here.
You know, I don't know the course of these cases. I do know, as to your point, you know, Attorney General, that some of these legal wins do appear to be at the Trump legal team's back right now. But having said that, I wonder how this all shakes out if he is indeed the Republican nominee and is reelected President of the United States. Is it from that point he is a president-elect, or when he formally takes over as president, that all this goes away?
I think it's going to be very messy, but I think at the end of the day that if he wins the presidency, you know, he will be able to deal with these cases, and will be, you know, they will not be a barrier to him continuing to serve as president.
What type of a presidency do you think it would be? Some have said it would be, you know, a retribution presidency.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I'm against Trump as the nominee is because I don't think he's going to move the country forward. You know, there's a lot of attention paid to the polls that show him 2 or 3 points ahead of Biden, but very little attention is being paid to the polls that are showing some of the other candidates, like Haley, beating Biden by 17 points, and I feel that a Republican candidate who's able to win a decisive victory will be much better positioned than Trump to move the country forward. I'm also worried that, you know, he will, you know, his style of governance, his continuing to pander to anger and frustration versus a constructive approach to solving our problems, is going to be chaotic and not accomplish very much. He'll be a lame duck president. I also, however, although a lot of people like to get me talking about my concerns over a Trump presidency, I'm also horrified by the prospect of a Biden presidency. I think the most dangerous players on the field have been, for the last 2 decades, the Democratic left, radical left. They've created Trump, and they continue to breathe life into him, and they have this no-holds-barred tactics, and Biden has essentially facilitated them and gone and enabled them, and that's why we are where we are, and I think Biden, not only because he clearly is not up to the job, but also because his policies are divisive, you know, I think that will be very bad for the country.
But if that's your choice, Joe Biden or Donald Trump, where does Bill Barr go?
Well, as I said, I'll jump off that bridge when I get to it.
I can't imagine
I think that's
supporting Donald Trump, though, given all the bad blood and everything else.
Well, I could not support Biden. I don't see any possibility of supporting Biden.
Let me step back from this and get your thoughts of what a Trump presidency would be, because he is leading in the polls. He is leading against Joe Biden. You're quite correct to say that others like Nikki Haley, lead the president occupant of the White House by a country mile. Having said all of that, though, and if that happens, many have said he will have a devil of a time filling a cabinet, given his treatment of you after the fact. Says he fired you, you actually quit, and it was very amiable when you left. And others have come to learn were not happy with the way they were tweeted out of a job or worse, and that doesn't bode well for the president selecting a loyal cabinet. What do you think of that?
I think he will be able to populate a cabinet and government positions because, you know, ambition will lead people to take those jobs. The question is what kind of people they will be. And I think Trump needs people around him who will push back and help keep him on the straight and narrow, frankly. And I am concerned that if he doesn't, during his first term, the main way that could be done is by pointing out to him how this would hurt his prospects for a second term. Once he wins a second term, I don't know, what considerations, can be used to push back against bad ideas.
Bill, I'm just curious what you would say to someone who wanted your advice because Donald Trump had told him, I want you to be my next attorney general. It took you out of retirement, a former attorney general yourself for President Bush, and you took the job, maybe with mixed feelings looking back at the whole experience. What would you tell that person seeking out your advice?
I would say in this day and age, even apart from Trump, in this day and age, you have to expect, a lot of incoming artillery and attacks, and ultimately leaving the office. And then with Trump, that probably, that even makes it far more challenging. He has to be ready to say no and to resign. Trump has made it plain that that he's going to respond to what he considers the left wing's no holds barred approach by fighting fire with fire, and whatever tactics they use, we're going to use. They've used the government against me. I'm going to use it against them. That's one of the reasons I'm opposed to him. And I think for people going into that administration, I think they have to be ready to oppose the abuse of government power.
Bill Barr, always good talking to you and your frankness. Thank you for your service to this country under 2 different presidents. Have a Merry Christmas, Bill. Thank you again.
Same to you, Neil. Thank you.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.